They called us cowards. Standing in their gleaming halls of marble and hard light, the warlords of the Orion Spur laughed at our drones, our orbital strikes, our preference for survival over senseless glory. They demanded our greatest warriors, expecting hulking brutes in shiny armor to die in their arena. We didn't send soldiers. We sent a retired mechanic with a bad knee and a grandmother who used to knit on the porch. We sent the Boogeyman and Baba Yaga. The air in the High Council chamber tasted like copper and stale ammonia. Ambassador Daniel stood at the center of the obsidian floor, the soles of his Oxford shoes sticking slightly to the polished stone. He was sweating. A single cold drop tracked down his spine, soaking into the cotton of his undershirt. He hated this room. He hated the towering, vaulted ceilings that made his voice sound thin and reedy. Most of all, he hated the smell. The Velnar smelled like dried blood and hot dust, a biological intimidation tactic that worked entirely too well. High General Krokotar leaned forward in his massive, throne-like chair. The alien was a mountain of chitin and muscle, his exoskeleton a deep, bruised purple. When he breathed, his mandibles clicked, a sharp, wet sound that echoed in the cavernous room. "You hide," Krokotar rumbled. The translation earpiece shoved deep into Daniel's ear hissed with static before delivering the flat, digitized English. "Your species hides behind glass screens. You send machines of metal and wire to do your bleeding. You drop fire from the stars. You are cowards." Daniel shifted his weight. His left knee popped loudly in the silence. He didn't look heroic. He looked like an accountant who had missed 3 nights of sleep, which wasn't far from the truth. "We prefer efficiency, General," Daniel said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tasting bile. "The Terran Coalition does not see the value in throwing lives away when a kinetic strike achieves the same strategic objective." "Efficiency." Krokotar spat the word. A glob of acidic saliva hit the obsidian floor, hissing as it ate into the stone. "Efficiency is the refuge of the weak. The galaxy is forged in blood. We have proposed a simple terms of surrender for this sector. A trial of champions. 3 cycles on the dead world of Kalen 4. Your best against our vanguard. If your flesh is as strong as your machines, you keep the sector. If you fail, you withdraw." Daniel looked at the other council members. The avian Silthi, the reptilian Drax. They were all watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. They wanted a show. They wanted to see humans torn apart by their 4-armed, plasma-wielding zealots in the mud. They wanted to prove that humanity's rapid expansion was a fluke of engineering, not inherent strength. "You want infantry combat," Daniel said slowly. "We want to see your warriors," Krokotar growled. "Not your toys, no drones, no orbital fire, no artificial intelligence. Flesh, blood, and handheld weapons. 2 of your greatest against 200 of our initiates. Prove you have a soul, human." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled handkerchief. He wiped his forehead. The cotton was rough against his skin. He felt a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. He didn't feel pride in what he was about to do. He just felt sick. "General," Daniel said, lowering the handkerchief, "you don't understand our history. We didn't build drones and orbital lasers because we are afraid to fight." He paused, looking down at his scuffed shoes. "We built them because we are terrified of what happens when we do it ourselves." Krokotar laughed. It sounded like grinding stones. "Empty words. Will you send your champions or will you run?" Daniel sighed. It was a long, rattling exhale. "We accept your terms, Kalen 4. 2 of ours, 200 of yours. No air support." The council erupted into murmurs of approval and clicking mandibles. Krokotar sat back, looking thoroughly satisfied. "We will broadcast the slaughter to your core worlds. Prepare your mourning rituals." Daniel turned and walked out of the chamber. The heavy doors sealed shut behind him with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the noise. The corridor was empty, save for his aide, a young woman named Sarah, holding a data pad. She looked pale. "Sir?" she asked quietly. "Did they accept the treaty?" "They demanded the trial of champions," Daniel said. He loosened his tie, the silk slipping through his damp fingers. "Call Geneva. Tell them to authorize the Black Site Protocol." Sarah's eyes widened. She dropped the stylus she was holding. It clattered loudly against the deck plating. "Sir, the Omega files, but they're retired. I know what they are," Daniel interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The aliens want to see our soul, Sarah. Let's show them the dark." The dirt of the Nebraska farm felt dry and powdery under Albert's boots. He was 62 years old. His back ached with a dull, constant throb that radiated down to his left hip. He was currently leaning over the open hood of a 2045 Ford pickup, a grease-stained rag in his hand, staring at a carburetor that refused to cooperate. The air smelled of motor oil, dry grass, and the faint, sweet scent of rotting apples from the orchard behind the barn. Albert liked the smell. It was quiet here. The wind rustled through the cornstalks, a dry, papery whisper. He heard the crunch of gravel before he saw the vehicle. Albert didn't reach for a weapon. He just slowly wiped his hands on the rag, feeling the grit of the grease grinding against his calluses. He closed the hood of the truck with a heavy metallic thud and turned around. A sleek, matte black hover sedan hovered over his driveway. The dust settled around it. The door popped open, and a young man in a crisp charcoal suit stepped out. The kid looked nervous. He was sweating, despite the climate-controlled car he had just left. "Mr. Albert Ward?" the suit asked. His voice trembled slightly. "Just Albert," he replied. His voice was gravelly, unused. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks. "I'm Agent Miller, Terran Intelligence," the kid said, taking a tentative step forward. He stopped when Albert didn't move. "We have a situation, sir. The Orion Accord has broken down. The Velnar demanded a trial of champions." Albert stared at him. A fly buzzed lazily past his ear. He didn't swat it. "Sounds like a job for the Marines, or those shiny new Spartan units." "They specifically outlawed augmentations, AI and heavy armor, sir," Miller said, swallowing hard. "They want raw infantry. The brass. They pulled the Omega files." Albert closed his eyes. The ache in his back seemed to flare up, burning hot. He remembered the smell of burning flesh, the deafening roar of trench sweepers in the Jovian Wars, the wet tearing sound a combat knife makes when it hits an artery. He had spent 15 years trying to forget the specific weight of a tactical vest. "I'm old, kid," Albert said softly. "My knees are shot. I wake up 3 times a night." "You're the Boogeyman, sir," Miller said, the reverence in his voice making Albert sick to his stomach. "We need you." Albert looked at the barn. He looked at the half-fixed truck. He tossed the greasy rag onto the bumper. "Who else?" Miller hesitated. "They're waking up Helen." Albert's jaw tightened. God help them. 1,000 miles away, in a dimly lit, high-rise apartment in Seattle, rain lashed against the reinforced glass. Helen sat in a worn leather armchair. The room smelled of old tea leaves and menthol muscle rub. She was knitting. The rhythmic click-clack of the metal needles was the only sound in the room, steady as a metronome. She wore a heavy gray cardigan. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun. Her left hand had a slight tremor. She paused her knitting, stared at her trembling fingers, and willed them to stop. They didn't. She let out a small, irritated sigh. The security terminal on her wall chimed. Helen didn't look up. "Door is unlocked, Director." The heavy steel door slid open. Director Hayes walked in, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick rug. He stood in the doorway, awkwardly holding a black briefcase. "Helen," Hayes said. "You look tired, Thomas," she replied, her voice soft, melodic, but entirely devoid of warmth. She looped the yarn around the needle and pulled it through. "You're getting jowls." Hayes cleared his throat. "The Velnar called us out. Ground combat, no tech, just blood." Helen stopped knitting. She placed the needles carefully in her lap. She looked up at Hayes. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, like ice on a frozen lake. There was absolutely nothing behind them. No fear, no excitement, no hesitation. Just a vast, terrifying emptiness. "How many?" she asked. 200 of their Vanguard elites, Hayes said. He set the briefcase on the coffee table and popped the latches. It opened with a sharp clack. Inside, resting on black velvet, was a pair of custom-milled kinetic handguns. Matte steel, heavy, scratched from years of use. Beside them lay a set of throwing knives, their edges gleaming dully in the low light. No lasers, no plasma, just brutal, primitive geometry designed to separate tissue from bone. Helen reached out and picked up one of the heavy pistols. Her left hand stopped trembling the moment her fingers wrapped around the textured grip. The weight of it was familiar. It felt like coming home to a house that had burned down. "And who is my partner?" she asked, racking the slide. The sharp, mechanical clack echoed in the quiet room. "Albert." Helen allowed a tiny, almost imperceptible smile to touch the corners of her mouth. It didn't reach her eyes. "I suppose I should pack a sweater. I hear Kalen 4 is damp this time of year." Kalen 4 smelled like rotten eggs and wet pennies. The atmosphere was a toxic soup of sulfur and perpetual acid rain. The sky was a bruised, sickly yellow, churning with heavy clouds. The arena the Velnar had chosen was a blasted wasteland of jagged obsidian outcroppings and deep, sucking mud trenches. High orbit. The Velnar flagship Blood of the Covenant hung in the void like a massive, jagged dagger. On the observation deck, General Krokatar stood with his arms crossed, watching the holographic projection of the battlefield. The arena was ringed with remote camera drones, broadcasting the feed to trillions across the Orion Spur. "The human drop pod has breached the atmosphere," his tactical officer hissed, mandibles clicking rapidly. "Only one pod. Scanners indicate minimal shielding. No heavy weapons detected." Krokatar snorted. "They send lambs to the slaughter. Dispatch the first wave. 20 initiates. Let the galaxy see how humanity bleeds." Down in the mud, the human drop pod hit the earth with a deafening crunch. It wasn't a sleek, aerodynamic vessel. It looked like a rusted iron coffin, Steam hissed from the hydraulic seals as the heavy door blew outward, landing in the mud with a wet slap. Albert stepped out first. He wasn't wearing power armor. He wore a heavily padded canvas duster over flexible Kevlar plating. His boots sank 2 inches into the muck. He smelled the sulfur, grimaced, and spat a wad of saliva into the dirt. He reached back into the pod and pulled out an ancient, terrifying piece of machinery. A fully automatic, drum-fed 12-gauge trench sweeper. The metal was worn smooth, silver showing through the black, anodized finish. Helen stepped out behind him. She wore a dark, waterproof trench coat, cinched tight at the waist. She had a tactical rig strapped over her chest, bristling with kinetic magazines and dull gray blades. She pulled a slim cigar from her pocket, clamped it between her teeth, and lit it with a battered Zippo. The flame briefly illuminated her pale, deeply lined face. "Mud," Albert grumbled, shifting his weight. His bad knee protested loudly. "I hate mud." "Stop complaining, old man," Helen said, exhaling a thin stream of blue smoke that was instantly snatched away by the wind. "Keep your spacing. Watch my flanks." The ground began to vibrate. Through the yellow fog, a mile away, the Velnar vanguard appeared. 20 of them. They were terrifying to behold. 9 feet tall, entirely encased in polished ceremonial plate armor. They wielded crackling plasma halberds and heavy kinetic repeaters. They roared, a horrifying guttural sound that tore through the heavy air. Up in the orbital flagship, Krokotar watched the feed. The 2 humans were just standing there. The old man was checking the action on his primitive projectile weapon. The old woman was smoking. They weren't running. They weren't taking cover. "They are frozen in fear," Krokotar sneered. Down in the dirt, Albert watched the Velnar charge. They were fast, covering the ground with terrifying bounding strides. 800 yards, 600. "Tactics are sloppy," Albert muttered. "They're bunching up." "They think we're prey," Helen said. She reached down and drew the 2 heavy steel handguns from her holsters. She didn't raise them. She just let them hang at her sides. 400 yards. "Albert," Helen said softly. "Yeah. Light 'em up." Albert didn't yell. He didn't scream a battle cry. He just raised the heavy trench sweeper, locked the stock against his shoulder, and pulled the trigger. The sound wasn't the high-pitched pew-pew of plasma or the clean hum of a laser. It was a deafening, concussive, rolling thunderclap. Boom, 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 boom. The recoil violently shoved Albert backward, his boots sliding in the mud, but he leaned into it, his face an impassive mask of grim concentration. The weapon spat a wall of depleted uranium buckshot downrange at supersonic speeds. At 300 yards, the lead Velnar warrior simply exploded. The kinetic force of a dozen uranium pellets striking his ceremonial armor simultaneously shattered the plating, turning the hardened metal into shrapnel that shredded the warrior behind him. The Velnar charge faltered instantly. They had expected energy shields to flare. They had expected honorable melee. They did not expect to be hit by a microscopic meteor shower of raw, unfeeling lead. Albert dumped the 50-round drum in less than 10 seconds. The barrel of the shotgun was glowing cherry red, hissing as the acid rain hit it. The smell of sulfur was entirely overpowered by the acrid biting stench of cordite and burnt powder. Before the empty shell casings had even hit the mud, Helen was moving. She didn't run, she walked. It was a terrifying measured glide, eating up the distance between them and the staggered, bleeding Velnar survivors. A massive alien, missing half its faceplate, raised a plasma repeater, screaming in rage. Helen didn't break stride. She raised her right hand and fired twice. Crack, crack. The heavy kinetic slugs punched straight through the alien's hardened chest plate, throwing the 9-foot giant backward into the mud with a wet crunch. Another Velnar lunged from her blind spot, swinging a crackling halberd. Helen ducked. The superheated plasma hissed inches over her silver hair. In the same fluid motion, she dropped her left gun, drew a heavy serrated combat knife, and drove it upward into the soft, unarmored joint beneath the alien's arm. She twisted the blade violently, pulled it out, caught her falling gun before it hit the ground, and shot the alien through the back of the neck as it collapsed. It took exactly 42 seconds. The wind howled through the jagged rocks. 20 Velnar Vanguard lay dead or dying in the mud. Albert walked up behind Helen, the heavy, metallic clatter of a fresh drum magazine locking into his shotgun breaking the silence. He looked down at the carnage. He didn't look proud. He looked incredibly, impossibly tired. Helen took a slow drag from her cigar. The ash blew away in the wind. She looked up at one of the hovering camera drones, staring directly through the lens. Up in the orbital flagship, the silence on the bridge was absolute. Krokatar's mandibles had stopped clicking. The translation software on the feed caught the human woman's words, cold and sharp as cracked ice. "Send the rest," Helen whispered. The acid rain intensified, turning Kalen 4's blasted surface into a sucking, treacherous slurry. It drummed against Albert's canvas duster with a heavy, rhythmic thudding, soaking through the seams. The water was cold, but it carried a chemical burn that stung his cheeks and made his eyes water. He didn't wipe his face. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that inevitably followed the first trigger pull. He hated this part, the brief, agonizing window between the first engagement and the main assault, where your body realized exactly how old and fragile it was. His left knee throbbed in time with his racing heartbeat. The cartilage was gone, ground into dust over 3 decades of deployments across the Sol system, leaving only bone grinding against bone. He popped the smoking drum out of the trench sweeper. The metal burned through his thick leather gloves, singeing the pads of his fingers. He hissed, dropping the empty drum into the mud with a wet shuck, and slammed a fresh one home. 40 seconds, Helen said. She was standing 6 feet away, partially shielded by a jagged outcropping of obsidian. She hadn't holstered her handguns. She was carefully thumbing fresh rounds into a spare magazine, her eyes fixed on the yellow fog ahead. They won't bunch up this time. Let them spread, Albert grunted, racking the heavy slide of the shotgun. More room for the buckshot to breathe. Your hands are shaking, old man. Albert looked down at his grip on the forend. The barrel was vibrating slightly. He squeezed the wood until his knuckles turned white under the leather, forcing the tremor to stop. Just the cold, Helen, just the cold. Through the sulphurous mist, the ground began to vibrate again. This time, it wasn't a reckless, roaring charge. It was a calculated advance. The dull, rhythmic thud of heavy boots squelching in the mud echoed across the wasteland. Then came the light. Dozens of bright, blindingly blue flares ignited in the fog. Plasma repeaters. The Velnar weren't going to close the distance for a melee this time. They were going to try and glass the grid square. "Cover!" Albert barked, his voice cracking. He threw his weight sideways, his bad knee buckling as he hit the deck. He slid behind a waist-high ridge of volcanic rock just as the air above him tore apart. The sound of incoming plasma wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched, shrieking crackle, like a massive sheet of canvas being ripped in half right next to your ear. Superheated bolts of blue energy slammed into the obsidian ridge. The rock didn't shatter. It instantly melted, glowing white-hot and spitting globules of molten stone into the mud. The heat washed over Albert, searing the exposed skin on the back of his neck. The smell of cooking ozone and melted minerals was suffocating. 50 targets, advancing in a wide crescent. Helen's voice was remarkably calm, filtering through the comms bead in Albert's ear over the deafening hiss of the plasma barrage. They are attempting a pincer. Left flank is heavy. Albert pressed his face into the mud, tasting sulfur and old iron. He couldn't pop up to shoot. The volume of fire was too dense. The Velnar were pouring localized suppression, inching closer with every volley. The air grew uncomfortably hot. His duster began to smoke from the ambient heat of the melting cover. "They got smart," Albert wheezed, coughing on the acrid smoke. "Energy shields?" "Scanners say no," Helen replied. "They still believe kinetic weapons are primitive. They just don't want to get hit." "Arrogant bastards," Albert muttered. He reached down to his thigh rig. The trench sweeper was useless at this range, and he couldn't stand up to use it anyway. He unclasped a heavy, matte black cylinder. It looked like an oversized soup can, an M44 fragmentation grenade. Old Earth tech, nasty, unpredictable. "Helen, I'm going to throw a rock. When the blue stops, you thin the herd." Understood. Albert pulled the pin. The metal ring bit into his glove. He didn't cook it. He just rolled onto his back, braced his good leg against the mud, and hurled the cylinder over the melting rock as hard as his aching shoulder would allow. It sailed through the yellow fog. A Velnar warrior, 9 feet of purple chitin and ceremonial armor, tracked the small, unpowered object with its targeting optics. It didn't register as an energy weapon. It didn't register as a threat. The warrior ignored it, keeping its heavy plasma repeater focused on Albert's rock. The grenade landed in the mud directly between 4 advancing Velnar. The explosion didn't produce a massive fireball. It was a sharp, concussive crack that violently displaced the air, followed by the terrifying, invisible shriek of 3,000 tungsten ball bearings expanding outward at Mach 4. The suppression fire on Albert's rock stopped instantly. Albert heard the sickening sound of metal tearing and wet, heavy bodies collapsing into the mud. He didn't wait to look. He rolled out from behind the cover, the trench sweeper already shouldered. Through the thinning smoke, he saw the chaos. 4 Velnar were down, their armor shredded by the tungsten storm. The rest of the line had staggered, their discipline breaking for just a fraction of a second in the face of the ear-shattering concussive blast. That fraction of a second was all Helen needed. She stepped out from behind her outcropping. She didn't seek new cover. She just walked forward into the teeth of the enemy line, her pale blue eyes locked on the closest targets. She raised both heavy pistols. Crack, 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 crack. The rhythm was mechanical, perfect, unfeeling. She didn't aim for center mass. The heavy ceremonial chest plates could occasionally deflect a glancing kinetic slug. She aimed for the joints, the armpits, the soft, unarmored throat ridges, the ocular visors. Every time her pistols barked, a Velnar dropped. No theatrics, just brutal, simple physics. a piece of lead traveling faster than the speed of sound, hitting biological matter. Albert pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the screaming in his knee. The Velnar on the right flank realized the danger and swung their heavy weapons toward Helen. Albert didn't let them acquire the target. He opened up with the trench sweeper, hip-firing the heavy weapon as he limped forward. Boom, boom, boom! The depleted uranium buckshot tore into the Velnar ranks, chewing through armor and flesh alike. The recoil was punishing, driving Albert back a half step with every trigger pull. But he leaned into it, his face locked in a rictus of sheer, stubborn defiance. They were two aging humans standing in the mud, bleeding and exhausted. And they were walking through the pride of the Velnar vanguard like a scythe through dry wheat. High above the slaughter, the bridge of the blood of the Covenant was dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the ship's fusion drives and the rapid, erratic clicking of General Krokotar's mandibles. He stood before the massive holographic projection, his 4 fists clenched tight enough to crack his own chitin. The feed was unsparing. The camera drone zoomed in with terrifying clarity, capturing every gruesome detail. Krokotar watched an initiate, a warrior who had spent 60 cycles mastering the blade and the plasma rifle, get his knee blown out by a kinetic slug, collapse into the mud, and take a second slug through the cranium before he even hit the ground. What is this?" a tactical officer whispered. His voice trembled. Krokotar didn't answer. He couldn't. His tactical overlays were struggling to process the data. The human weapons were entirely mechanical, chemical propellants expanding in a metal tube to launch solid mass. There were no tracking systems to jam, no energy frequencies to phase shift against, no heat signatures for the shields to deflect. It was primitive. It was barbaric. It was utterly unstoppable. "They are not fighting with honor," Krokotar snarled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They do not challenge the blade. They do not face the plasma. They just erase us from a distance." "General," the communications officer chimed in, his voice tight, "the core worlds are watching the broadcast. The morale metrics, they are plummeting. The citizens are demanding we glass the arena from orbit." "No!" Krokotar roared, slamming a massive fist into the tactical console, shattering the crystalline display. "We demanded this trial. If we break the terms, the Terran Coalition will turn their dreadnoughts on our home worlds. We must kill them in the dirt. Send the second wave. Send the shock troops. Tell them to close the distance. Overwhelm them with numbers. Break their bones." Down in the mud, the second wave arrived before the first had finished dying. 70 Velnar shock troops crested the ridge. They didn't bother with suppression fire. They activated their heavy plasma halberds, the blades igniting with a deafening bass-heavy hum, and charged. "Albert!" Helen yelled. "Reloading!" She dropped her empty magazines, the metal clattering against the rocks, and reached for fresh ones. Albert stepped in front of her, planting his feet in the thick muck. The vanguard was 60 yards out, 50. He squeezed the trigger of the trench sweeper. Click. Empty. He didn't panic. He just dropped the heavy shotgun, letting it hang on its tactical sling, and drew the heavy .45 caliber revolver from his hip. It held 6 shots. There were 70 aliens charging him. "Take your time, Helen," Albert muttered, cocking the hammer. He fired. The heavy slug punched through the chest of a charging Velnar, dropping it. He cocked and fired again. Another alien staggered, clutching a ruined shoulder, but kept coming. The sheer mass of the charge was too much. They were too fast. 30 yards. 20. A Velnar warrior, its armor slick with the purple blood of its comrades, lunged forward, swinging its halberd in a wide, decapitating arc. Albert threw himself backward. He wasn't fast enough. The superheated edge of the plasma blade didn't hit him squarely, but it grazed his left shoulder. The intense heat instantly vaporized the wet canvas of his duster and flash-cooked the flesh beneath. Albert screamed. It wasn't a heroic shout. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure, blinding agony. He hit the mud hard, the impact jarring his ruined knee and driving the breath from his lungs in a ragged gasp. The smell of his own burning flesh filled his nostrils, sickeningly sweet and metallic. The Velnar warrior towered over him, raising the halberd for a killing downward thrust. The alien's mandibles clicked in triumph. The halberd never fell. A heavy serrated combat knife buried itself to the hilt in the soft tissue just beneath the Velnar's jawline. The alien froze, its 4 eyes widening in shock. Helen stood directly behind the giant. She had holstered her guns. Her silver hair had come loose from its bun, plastering to her face in the toxic rain. She didn't try to pull the giant backward. She wasn't strong enough. Instead, she grabbed the hilt of the knife with both hands, planted her boot on the back of the Velnar's armored knee, and kicked inward with all her weight. The joint gave way with a wet crack. As the alien collapsed to its knees, bringing its head down to her level, Helen viciously twisted the knife and ripped it outward. A geyser of dark purple blood sprayed across her pale face and gray cardigan. She didn't pause. She stepped over the dying alien, placing herself firmly between the charging horde and Albert, who was writhing in the mud, clutching his charred shoulder. Helen drew her pistols. She didn't look like a grandmother anymore. Covered in mud and alien blood, her face set in a mask of absolute, predatory focus, she looked like exactly what she was. A ghost, a relic of humanity's darkest, most desperate wars. She didn't aim at the charging mass. She aimed at the ground in front of them, at the outcroppings of volcanic glass that jutted from the mud. She fired, emptying both magazines into the rock in less than 3 seconds. The heavy kinetic slugs hit the obsidian with terrifying force, shattering the brittle, glass-like stone. Millions of razor-sharp shards of volcanic glass exploded outward at knee height, a localized shrapnel mine born of pure physics and spite. The front line of the Velnar charge ran face first into the invisible cloud of glass. Unarmored legs and lower torsos were shredded instantly. Screams of agony replaced the roaring battle cries as 24 giants collapsed into the mud, their own momentum tearing their legs apart on the jagged shards. The charge collapsed entirely. The Velnar behind the front line tripped over their dying comrades, sliding in the bloody mud, their formation completely broken. Helen calmly dropped her empty magazines and reloaded. "Get up, Albert," she said. Her voice wasn't gentle. It was a command. "You are bleeding on my boots." Albert spat a mouthful of bloody mud onto the ground. He rolled onto his side, his face pale, sweat mixing with the toxic rain. He looked at his left shoulder. The flesh was blackened and cracked, oozing clear fluid. The pain was nauseating, a bright, hot spike driving directly into his brain. He gritted his teeth, grabbed his dropped revolver with his good hand, and forced himself to his feet. His bad knee trembled so violently he almost went back down, but he locked it, swaying slightly in the wind. He looked at the broken, writhing mass of Velnar warriors 50 feet away. Then he looked at Helen. She was wiping a thick smear of purple blood from her cheek with the back of her hand, her eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy. "I need a vacation," Albert wheezed, his breath rattling in his chest. "Kill them first," Helen replied. "Then you can sit down." The smell of cooked meat was the worst part. Albert leaned heavily against a jagged spur of black rock, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The left side of his canvas duster was gone, vaporized by the plasma graze. Beneath it, the flesh of his shoulder was a charred, blistering ruin. It smelled exactly like a bad barbecue, sweet and heavy, a scent that made his empty stomach violently contract. He spat another glob of bloody saliva into the mud, watching the acid rain instantly begin to dilute it. "Kit," Albert grunted. His voice was barely a rasp. Helen didn't look away from the yellow fog. She kept her right pistol raised, her pale eyes tracking the shadowy movements of the remaining Velnar troops who had retreated out of immediate visual range. With her left hand, she reached into her tactical rig, pulled out a small, foil-wrapped packet, and tossed it blindly backward. It hit Albert in the chest. He fumbled with the packet using his good right hand. His fingers were stiff with cold and slick with mud. He tore it open with his teeth. Inside was a thick, gel-soaked trauma pad, old-school chemical coagulant and topical nerve deadener. Albert shoved the gunmetal barrel of his empty revolver into his waistband. He took a shallow breath, braced the back of his head against the cold stone, and slapped the gel pad directly onto the weeping burn. He didn't scream this time. His jaw clamped shut so hard he heard a molar crack. His eyes rolled back briefly, seeing a flash of pure white behind his eyelids before the nerve deadener kicked in, turning the blinding agony into a dull, heavy throbbing. He strapped it tight with a piece of canvas torn from his coat, tying the knot with his right hand and his teeth. "You're slowing down," Helen observed quietly. She ejected a half-spent magazine, caught it before it hit the mud, and slid it back into a pouch. She slapped a fresh one into the grip. "If you drop, I am not carrying you." "I know," Albert wheezed. He bent down, ignoring the loud pop of his bad knee, and retrieved the trench sweeper from the muck. He wiped the action clear with a dirty sleeve. "How many left?" 110, give or take." Helen took a slow breath. The tremor in her left hand had returned, a slight rhythmic shaking. She stared at it for a second, annoyed, then gripped the pistol tighter until her knuckles paled. "They are scared, Albert. They are trying to figure out how to die with dignity." Up in orbit, dignity was the furthest thing from General Krokotar's mind. He stared at the holographic projection, his mandibles spread wide in a silent, horrified grimace. The floor of the arena was littered with the bodies of his vanguard, the finest warriors of the Orion Spur, clad in ceremonial plate, butchered like livestock. The human broadcast was unfiltered. The audio feed picked up the sounds of the dying Velnar, the gurgling breaths, the wet shifting of shredded armor, the sickening crunch of the human woman stepping on a severed chitinous limb. "General," the communications officer whispered. He didn't look up from his console. He couldn't stomach the holographic feed anymore. "The Terran Coalition, they are broadcasting a message on all open channels." Krokotar's eyes snapped to the officer. "What message? Terms of surrender?" "No, sir." The officer swallowed hard. "It's just an audio file, spliced into the live feed." Play it." The bridge filled with a harsh, staticky audio clip. It was the voice of the Terran ambassador, Daniel, recorded from the council chamber hours earlier. "We didn't build drones and orbital lasers because we are afraid to fight. We built them because we are terrified of what happens when we do it ourselves." The words hung in the sterile, heavily filtered air of the bridge. They didn't sound like a boast anymore. They sounded like a warning that Krokatar had entirely failed to heed. "They are mocking us," Krokatar growled, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and a cold, creeping dread. He slammed his fist onto the comms panel. "Vanguard leader, do you hear me down in that dirt?" A heavily distorted voice crackled back over the comms. It was garbled by static and the sound of heavy rain. "We hear you, General. The demons, they use weapons of pure malice. No honor, only meat shredders." "I do not care about honor anymore," Krokatar roared, spittle flying from his mandibles. "Look at them, an old man with a ruined limb. A female who looks like she should be rotting in a crypt. They are meat, bleeding, fragile meat. Rush them. Do not use tactics. Do not form lines. Drown them in your bodies." Down in the mud, the surviving vanguard heard the order. They looked at each other, their 4 eyes wide and fearful behind their visors. But disobedience meant death for their bloodlines. The low, guttural roaring began again. It wasn't the triumphant war cry of the first wave. It was a desperate, panicked shriek of cornered animals forced to charge a wood chipper. Albert heard the sound. He leaned forward, resting the heavy barrel of the trench sweeper on the edge of the obsidian outcropping. He couldn't lift it with his left arm anymore. The shoulder was completely useless. He had to brace it on the rock. "Here they come," Albert muttered. He racked the slide. The heavy metallic clack was drowned out by the approaching thunder of heavy boots. Helen didn't say a word. She stepped out from the cover entirely, planting her boots in the thick mud. She lowered her stance, her gray cardigan soaked black with toxic rain and alien blood. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the swirling yellow fog. Then the fog broke, and a wall of purple chitin and crackling blue plasma descended upon them. It was no longer a battle. It was a brawl in a slaughterhouse. The Velnar hit the human position like a tidal wave of muscle and hardened armor. They didn't bother shooting. They just threw their massive 9-foot frames forward, swinging halberds, heavy fists, and the stocks of their rifles. Albert fired the trench sweeper until the barrel blistered his right hand through the leather glove. Boom! 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 At point-blank range, the depleted uranium buckshot didn't just penetrate armor, it liquefied what was behind it. A Velnar warrior charged the rock, mouth open in a scream. Albert shoved the glowing hot barrel directly into the alien's chest plate and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed Albert backward against the stone wall, bruising his ribs, as the alien was quite literally blown in half, spraying a fountain of dark blood over Albert's face. He blinked, the acidic blood stinging his eyes. He pulled the trigger again. Click, empty, and he only had one working arm. A Velnar shock trooper vaulted over the shattered corpse of its comrade, bringing a massive armored fist down toward Albert's head. Albert didn't have time to draw his revolver. He twisted violently, dropping to his right knee. The alien's fist smashed into the obsidian outcropping, shattering the stone and sending jagged fragments slicing through the air. Albert lunged upward from his knee, driving the heavy, solid steel stock of the empty shotgun directly into the Velnar's primary knee joint. The alien shrieked, collapsing forward. Albert dropped the shotgun, drew his heavy D-guard Bowie knife from his belt with his right hand, and buried the 10-inch blade deep into the side of the alien's thick neck. He didn't have the leverage to pull it out. Another Velnar crashed into him from the side, a glancing blow from a heavy shoulder pauldron that felt like being hit by a speeding truck. Albert was thrown 5 feet through the air, landing flat on his back in the sucking mud. His vision swam. Black spots danced at the edge of his periphery. The air was knocked completely out of his lungs, leaving him gasping silently like a beached fish. He tasted mud, sulfur, and copper. He rolled onto his side, fighting the suffocating darkness in his head. 10 feet away, Helen was performing a grisly, mechanical dance. She was completely surrounded by 5 towering Velnar warriors. She had no room to maneuver, nowhere to retreat, so she didn't. An alien lunged with a plasma halberd. Helen stepped inside the arc of the swing, letting the superheated blade hiss inches past her ear. She pressed the muzzle of her left pistol tight against the Velnar's ribcage and fired twice. As the giant fell, she spun, using the collapsing body as a shield against a heavy kinetic burst from another warrior. She aimed her right pistol over the dying alien's shoulder and fired, blowing the visor off the shooter. A third Velnar swung a heavy fist, catching Helen a glancing blow on the side of the head. The impact threw her off balance, her silver hair flying wildly as she stumbled backward into the mud. Albert watched her fall. A cold spike of dread pierced through his exhaustion. "Helen!" he croaked, scrambling for his dropped revolver in the slop. Helen hit the ground, but she didn't stay there. As the Velnar towered over her, raising a heavy boot to crush her skull, she rolled violently to the right. She didn't try to stand. From her back in the mud, she raised both pistols and emptied the remaining rounds in her magazines directly upward into the unarmored groin and inner thighs of the alien above her. The Velnar screamed, a horrific, high-pitched wail, and collapsed sideways. Helen sat up, dropping the empty pistols into the mud. They were useless now. She reached down to her boots and drew 2 slim, matte black combat blades. The remaining 2 Velnar hesitated. They looked at the old woman sitting in the mud, covered in the gore of their brothers, holding 2 small pieces of sharpened steel. She looked exhausted. Her left eye was swelling shut from the blow to the head. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, the red blood mixing starkly with the purple stains on her clothes. She looked up at them. The absolute, terrifying emptiness in her pale blue eyes hadn't changed. She planted her hands in the mud and slowly, painfully, pushed herself to her feet. Her joints popped. She took a slow breath, adjusting her grip on the knives. "Come on, then," Helen whispered. The Velnar charged. Albert finally found the grip of his revolver. He dragged it from the mud, cocked the hammer with his thumb, and fired blindly from his back. The heavy .45 caliber slug caught one of the charging Velnar in the side of the knee, dropping it instantly. Helen met the last one head on. The alien swung downward with a crackling halberd. Helen didn't dodge. She stepped directly into the alien's guard, raising her left forearm to block the heavy shaft of the weapon just below the plasma blade. The impact cracked her radius bone with a loud snap, but it stopped the weapon's descent. Without a sound, Helen drove the blade in her right hand upward, burying it under the Velnar's chin, straight up into its brain pan. She hung there for a second, her broken left arm resting on the shaft of the alien's halberd, her right hand gripping the knife embedded in its skull. The massive Velnor twitched once, then went entirely limp, its dead weight driving Helen backward into the mud. She didn't move to push it off. She just lay there, pinned beneath the 9-foot corpse, the toxic rain beating down on her face. Silence descended on the arena. The roaring was gone. The crackle of plasma had faded. The only sound was the heavy, relentless drumming of Kalen 4's acid rain against the broken armor and cooling flesh of 200 Velnar Vanguard. Albert lay in the mud, his chest heaving. He stared at the bruised yellow sky, letting the cold rain wash the blood and mud from his face. Every single nerve in his body was screaming. His shoulder was a white-hot agony. His ribs felt like shattered glass. Slowly, agonizingly, he rolled over. He dragged himself through the mud, pulling his weight with his good right arm, until he reached the Velnar corpse, pinning Helen. He wedged his boots against the mud, grabbed the heavy chitinous plating of the alien with his right hand, and heaved. The body rolled off her with a wet slop. Helen lay flat on her back. Her eyes were closed. Her chest was barely moving. Albert slumped into the mud beside her. He reached out with a trembling hand and pressed 2 fingers against her cold, clammy neck. He felt a pulse. Slow, thready, but there. "You alive, old woman?" Albert rasped. Helen's right eye fluttered open. The left was completely swollen shut. She looked at Albert. She looked at the blood dripping from his nose, the charred ruin of his shoulder, the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion etched into the deep lines of his face. "My knitting arm is broken, Albert," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual coldness. It just sounded profoundly tired. Albert let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it came out as a wet, ragged cough. He lay back in the mud, staring up at the hovering camera drone, watching them from 30 feet above. "Don't worry," Albert muttered, closing his eyes. "I'll buy you a sweater." High above the toxic clouds of Kalen 4, the bridge of the blood of the Covenant was a tomb. The holographic feed flickered, casting pale blue light across the ruined tactical consoles. The drones continued to circle the arena, their lenses zooming in on the 2 shattered human forms lying in the mud amidst a sea of purple corpses. No one on the bridge spoke. The heavy rhythmic breathing of the Velnar crew was the only sound, entirely devoid of the confident mandible clicking that had filled the room an hour ago. General Krokatar stared at his own hands. They were massive, chitinous, built to crush bone and tear flesh. He had conquered 12 star systems with these hands. Now they were trembling. He looked back at the projection. 200 of his finest. Generations of selective breeding, decaded of grueling martial training, encased in the most advanced ceremonial armor the Velnar Empire could forge. Butchered by an old man with a ruined leg and a female who looked like she belonged in a hospice. They hadn't used orbital strikes. They hadn't used artificial intelligence. They had used kinetic friction, chemical propellants, and a terrifying empty malice that Krokatar couldn't comprehend. "General," the communications officer whispered. His voice was completely hollow. "A Terran vessel has entered the system. It just dropped out of slip space." Krokatar didn't look up. "A dreadnought?" "No, sir. A medical frigate. Unarmed. They are hailing us. They are requesting immediate atmospheric entry to retrieve their champions." The officer swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet room. "They also transmitted a data packet to our high command. The treaty. The Terran coalition considers the trial concluded. Krokotar closed his eyes. The defeat wasn't just military, it was structural. The foundation of the Velnar superiority complex had been completely gutted in less than 20 minutes of mud and lead. "Let them pass," Krokotar rasped. "Order the fleet to stand down. Acknowledge their victory." Down in the muck of the arena, Albert watched the sky tear open. The clouds parted as a massive, blocky Terran dropship descended. It wasn't elegant. It was an ugly, utilitarian brick of gray titanium and roaring fusion thrusters. The sheer force of its downdraft flattened the toxic yellow fog, kicking up a localized hurricane of mud and acidic water. Albert didn't cover his face. He just let the rain hit him. The heat of the thrusters washed over his freezing, shaking body. The ship hovered 50 feet above the ground, and the side doors blew open. Ropes dropped. 6 figures in sterile, heavy-duty white hazard suits rappelled down, boots hitting the mud with synchronized heavy thuds. They didn't carry weapons. They carried folding titanium stretchers, trauma kits, and heavy oxygen tanks. The stark contrast made Albert want to laugh, but his ribs wouldn't allow it. A minute ago, it was plasma and butchery. Now, it was clinical, sterile, human efficiency. 2 medics reached Albert. One immediately slammed a thick, auto-injecting syringe into his uninjured thigh. Albert felt the icy rush of military-grade painkillers flood his system. The agonizing white-hot fire in his shoulder dulled to a distant, muffled ache. The world lost its sharp edges, going soft and fuzzy around the periphery. "Easy, sir," a muffled voice said through a white helmet. "We've got you. Try not to move." Albert tasted antiseptic. The smell of it cut sharply through the sulfur and the coppery scent of alien blood. It was the best thing he had ever smelled. They rolled him onto the rigid stretcher. The movement ground his broken ribs together, forcing a sharp grunt from his lips, but the painkillers kept him from passing out. He turned his head sideways. 10 feet away, 4 medics were hovering over Helen. They had her on a backboard. One medic was rapidly inflating a rigid splint around her shattered left arm. Another was wiping the thick, purple gore from her face, revealing the deep, bruising purple swelling around her left eye. She was unconscious. Her face was entirely slack. She looked incredibly old. "Is she—" Albert forced the words out, his tongue feeling thick and fuzzy. "She has a pulse," the medic above him said, snapping a heavy restraint strap across Albert's chest. "She's critical, but she's holding on. We're getting you both home. Cable up." The winch engaged. Albert felt the sickening lurch of gravity as the stretcher was ripped upward, leaving the muddy slaughterhouse behind. He looked down as he rose into the belly of the dropship. He saw the 200 dead giants. He saw his empty, mud-clogged trench sweeper lying in the dirt, abandoned. He closed his eyes, the heavy thrum of the ship's engines lulling him into a deep, chemical dark. He didn't dream of the mud. He dreamed of quiet. The air in the High Council chamber still smelled like stale ammonia, but the arrogance was gone. Ambassador Daniel stood on the polished obsidian floor. He wore the exact same charcoal suit he had worn 3 days ago, but he wasn't sweating. He didn't carry a handkerchief. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped casually behind his back. The vaulted ceiling felt less oppressive today. The alien warlords of the Orion Spur sat in their throne-like chairs, but they were hunched. The avian Silthi were ruffling their feathers nervously. The reptilian Drax refused to meet his eyes. High General Krokatar sat in the center. He looked diminished. The deep purple luster of his chitin had dulled to a sickly matte bruise. Daniel reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single, thin memory drive. He tossed it onto the obsidian floor. It landed with a tiny, sharp clink that echoed loudly in the silent room. "The revised treaty," Daniel said. His voice didn't crack. It was smooth, steady, and entirely devoid of gloating. "The Kalan sector remains under Terran coalition control. You will withdraw your fleets past the Perseus Arm. You will dismantle your forward operating bases along the border." Krokatar stared at the tiny silver drive on the floor. "And if we refuse?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. He let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. "General, we sent 2 of our retirees to fight your finest. We did this to spare your core worlds from our fleet. If you reject these terms, we will not send infantry next time. We will send the machines. We will burn your skies until the ash chokes your oceans, and we won't broadcast it for sport. We will just erase you." Krokatar's mandibles twitched, but he didn't click them. He didn't argue. He slowly raised a heavy, 4-fingered hand in a gesture of absolute capitulation. "We accept the terms. The sector is yours." Daniel nodded once. He turned on his heel, his Oxford shoes clicking sharply on the stone, and walked out of the chamber. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt incredibly tired. 6 months later. The rain in Nebraska was different than the rain on Kalan 4. It didn't burn. It smelled of wet topsoil, crushed green leaves, and the distant metallic tang of an approaching thunderstorm. Albert sat on the wide wooden porch of his farmhouse. The rocking chair creaked rhythmically underneath him. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee in his right hand. His left arm rested heavily on the armrest. The shoulder was mostly synthetic now, a web of vat-grown muscle and titanium grafting hidden beneath the sleeve of a thick flannel shirt. It ached when the barometric pressure dropped, a dull phantom reminder of the plasma graze. A heavy dark wood cane rested against the railing next to him. The 2045 Ford pickup still sat in the driveway, its hood closed. He hadn't touched it. He heard the crunch of gravel. A sleek, unmarked hover sedan pulled up to the house. The engine whined down, settling the chassis into the dirt. The passenger door opened. Helen stepped out. She wasn't wearing a tactical rig. She wore a heavy beige trench coat and sensible shoes. Her silver hair was pulled back into its usual tight bun. Her left arm hung perfectly straight by her side, stiff and unmoving. The doctors hadn't been able to fully repair the nerve damage from the shattered radius. She moved with a slight limp, favoring her right side. She walked up the wooden stairs of the porch. She didn't knock. She just pulled up a weathered folding chair and sat down next to him. They didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the rain fall on the cornfields. The rhythmic creak-creak of Albert's rocking chair filled the silence. "They gave me a medal," Helen said quietly, her voice still carrying that cold, melodic flatness, though the terrifying emptiness in her eyes had softened into a bone-deep exhaustion. "Me too," Albert grunted, taking a sip of his coffee. "Heavy thing. Threw it in the kitchen drawer with the spare batteries." "Sensible." Helen reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat. She pulled out a bulky, folded package wrapped in brown butcher paper. She tossed it onto Albert's lap. It hit his good leg with a soft thud. Albert set his coffee mug down on the railing. He picked up the package, his thick, calloused fingers peeling back the paper. It was a sweater. It was heavy, hand-knitted from thick, scratchy gray wool. The stitching on the left sleeve was slightly uneven, a clear testament to a left hand that couldn't quite hold the needle steady anymore. Albert stared at it. He ran his thumb over the uneven stitches. He felt a tight, unexpected lump form in his throat. He swallowed it down, his jaw clenching. "It's ugly," Albert said softly. "It is entirely functional," Helen replied, staring straight ahead at the rain. "It will keep the chill off your synthetic grafting, assuming you are smart enough to wear it." Albert slowly unfolded the heavy garment. He pulled his left arm through the sleeve, wincing slightly as the joint rotated, and pulled it over his head. It was slightly too tight across the chest, and the wool itched against his neck. It was perfect. "Fits fine," Albert muttered, leaning back in the rocking chair. "Good." They sat together on the porch as the storm rolled in. They weren't legends. They weren't gods of war. They were just two tired old ghosts sitting in the rain, finally allowed to rest in the quiet world they had bled to protect. The Boogeyman and Baba Yaga didn't talk about the mud, or the blood, or the fear. They just watched the corn grow. That wraps up the brutal saga of the Boogeyman and Baba Yaga. If you enjoyed this raw, gritty look at humanity's darkest legends, teaching the galaxy a lesson in the mud, hit that like button. We have plenty more original sci-fi stories coming your way, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a drop. Share this